Welcome back to another episode of Mormon Traditionalist Podcast. My name is Jaron O'Driscoll, and I am your host. And today I have a great interview guest on. Her name is Kim Smith. You might remember me mentioning that name on an earlier episode, and that's because Kim has actually helped me with research on the episodes about Philastus Hurlbut and William Godby. But I'll let Kim tell you about herself and what she does. Before we do, though, remember to leave a rating and review wherever you listen to this podcast. Please take 2 minutes and do that, folks. That is how this show gets put in front of more people like you that want to hear this message. Because the podcasting platforms see that people like it, and therefore I get bumped further up the list. Thank you so much for doing that. This episode topic is something that is honestly new to me. I literally knew nothing about it until I sat down with Kim and had this conversation. And it's this new idea floating around about this so-called conspiracy theory that Brigham Young had Joseph Smith assassinated. Now, this is pretty laughable to me, but there's a movement behind this that is actually gaining traction and leading people from the truth. So we're going to address it very seriously, head on. The people pushing this new narrative are actually doing a documentary that might actually be in the Sundance Film Festival, it's looking like. I've actually seen the trailer, and it is super deceptive. It's set up to make you think that maybe they're talking about finding out who the actual mob member was that killed Joseph, and just setting it up, to make it appealing to faithful members when it's actually a very anti-Mormon film and movement, which is exactly how the adversary operates. This will also be a 2-part series, as usual, with our guest interviews, so part 2 will drop next week. And without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Kim Smith. Hey, Kim, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm not doing too bad. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I'm really glad to have you here. It's actually an honor. For the audience, real quick, Kim has done a lot of research, and she'll tell you about this in a second. But she's done research for me on previous episodes and been a big lifesaver. So I really appreciate you for that, Kim. But why don't you give the audience a quick down and dirty of the research you do, what you do, who you are, and give them a little bit of your background.
Sure thing. I am what I call myself, I guess, an independent church historian and researcher. And what that basically means is that I work independently. And so I'm not tied down to any of the publishing companies, scholars, or any institution. And I study mostly primary source documents from the church archives. And so a lot of my research, I've been able to contribute to the Joseph Smith Foundation, who has done a lot of work in defending the restoration and defending the character of Joseph Smith. And a lot of my research has been published in 3 of their books. And I also help with, any research they need for vidcasts or articles and things like that. So I guess my expertise is a church historian researcher.
So you got to tell me first off, how much fun is it looking at those old documents and having to interpret the writing? And I've seen some of the documents you're talking about, and that seems like quite the task to undertake, just to try and read cursive and old style, old world cursive at that.
Right. It is actually very exciting. I actually love to see the actual original document. But thankfully, a lot of the transcribing has already been done through the Church History Library and the Joseph Smith the Joseph Smith papers. So there are some things that you do have to transcribe yourself or read the cursive, but a lot of that has actually already been done. But I do like to read or even fact check through primary source documents. So, no second, well, of course you're going to have secondhand documents, but going right straight to the source, I feel is where you really learn the history. And I think that's where my passion is, I guess you could say. I think that's, if you're going to put your research out there and you're going to make a claim, you want it to be like bulletproof, right? So.
Right. And I think that's probably more than a lot of people do too, especially if what they find fits their narrative.
Right. Yep. We want solid research out there. So yeah, we definitely do a lot of fact checking and making sure everything is correct before we make any claim.
Right. I think that gives a lot of credibility to the fact that you're not biased and not held down to any particular entity that would be wanting you to say certain things or not say certain things. And that's what brings us to what we're talking about today. This is a topic I had not heard about until just recently. But can you tell us, first off, the basis of this topic we're talking about today, this pseudo historical revisionist movement idea about Brigham Young?
Yeah, it's, most Latter-day Saints are unaware that there's this disturbing movement going on. And, I do like to call it a pseudo historical revisionist movement. It's because it literally is not based on any credible history, facts, data. There's just nothing to back this up. But it is a movement that's growing in popularity. And this movement is a belief that Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Willard Richards were secret conspirators in the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. And they not only believe this to be fact, but they are seeking to convince others that this is true. And they are leading a movement right now to lead members out of the church. And they are starting, I guess you can say, their own movement or religion.
So this is an actual branch off religion. It's not just a faction within otherwise faithful members. This is actually something that's drawing off its own religious branch.
Right. So many of those in this movement will claim to be active members, and they might be active members, but those that are leading this movement most of them are disaffected members who have left the church. Some have been excommunicated. Most of them do not believe that the church holds the Melchizedek priesthood. And not only do they not believe that the church holds the Melchizedek priesthood, they openly suggest that the leaders that are leading the church today are fallen leaders.
So that's something that is really interesting to me. We've seen a lot of these types of narratives coming up for a long time. Is this something like other topics that is a resurfacing and a rehashing of old ideas that were, once squashed and then come back to life, or is this its own brand new thing?
Essentially, it's basically the same old narrative that came out after the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, when Brigham Young did lead the saints to Utah. We know that after Joseph Smith was martyred, that there was the succession crisis, and Sidney Rigdon wanted control of the church. And then we know that Brigham Young, he was given the keys before the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. And then on August 8th, I believe, 1844, is when they had like a conference, and Sidney Rigdon gets up before the church, and he basically for an hour and a half gives a speech of why he needs to lead the church. And then when Brigham Young gets up to speak, then, that's when what we call the transfiguration of Brigham Young, when the audience basically saw the mantle of Joseph Smith fall on Brigham Young, and he spoke as if he were Joseph Smith. So after Sidney Rigdon then was basically rejected by the church, he went around and he actually started to convince members of the church that Joseph Smith was martyred because he was a fallen prophet. And he was able to lead away a small number of members, and he formed his own church, but that quickly dissolved in 1847. And then after that, there were, just different fractions, I guess you'd say, in Nauvoo, who were trying to usurp the authority away from Brigham Young and start their own religion, but none of them were ever successful. And so kind of this idea that Brigham Young was the usurper is what they all tried to claim, but no one went as far as to accuse him of actually being part of a conspiracy or being part of a plot to have Joseph Smith murdered in order to take over the church. So that part is actually new, and it's actually very astonishing.
Yeah, it seems as time goes on, the allegations have to become more and more extreme to get anybody to pay attention to them and give them any credence.
Right.
That's really interesting. So is there new information? Break it down for us and tell us, what is the information where this is coming from? Is there actual physical documentation that is being brought up to prove this? Is this a lot of anecdotal What is the evidence that's been brought up? Other than what has been brought up in the past about Joseph or about Brigham Young being a usurper, what is the actual evidence that they're bringing up to actually push it from usurping to a murder plot?
Right. Okay. So, I know you've talked on your podcast before about progressive Mormonism and the rewriting of church history, basically what we call the New Mormon history. So I just want you to think about for a minute, why do progressives and anti-Mormons use history to attack the church? Well, it's because history can be manipulated, it can be distorted, and it can be revised, and it can be reinterpreted. And so, that's the go-to, right? Is the history. So there are many evil historians and, many false witnesses from Joseph's own day. And it's easy for these historians or basically anybody to abuse these false witnesses, right, from history. We know that Joseph Smith taught, he said in his own history that, there were so many false allegations against him that it could fill up volumes. So, church history is filled with people that bear false witness. And so anybody can go in and use those accounts and reinterpret the history or present that, I guess you could say, just a one-sided, distorted view of the historical narrative through the selective use of documents. But the historical record does not support this conspiracy or this theory that that Brigham Young, John Taylor, and Willard Richards was anyway involved in a plot to murder the prophet Joseph Smith.
That's something that is actually really important to me and hits close to home for me. I am actually related to Willard Richards, not directly through him, but through his brother. I believe it's his brother. I'm direct from his line. So we talked a lot about Willard Richards and about how he was one that was, in the jail with Joseph Smith when he was assassinated. And I've always felt a special tie to the restoration and to Joseph Smith in that way. And so this whole narrative actually really irks me a little bit in more of a personal way.
Right.
What is it that they're saying? What part did Willard Richards and then also obviously Brigham Young and John Taylor have in this so-called plot?
Okay, so just let me back up a little bit. So the group that's behind it is a group that they call themselves the Doctrine of Christ group. And I just bring that up because, like I said, it's a growing movement, and they've actually been able to lead a large number of members out of the church. But so in what they believe essentially is that because Brigham Young usurps the authority from the church today does not have the Melchizedek priesthood, right? And so they believe that their group particularly has received the Melchizedek priesthood, and they are even baptizing people into their movement. So how would you convince, if you were trying to start your own movement, how are you going to convince members that you have the truth, right? That you have the authority? Well, you have to take away who had the authority, right? Brigham Young is our priesthood link to the prophet Joseph Smith. So if you take out Brigham Young from the equation, where did the priesthood go and who has it today? Right?
Right.
I mean, that seems pretty clear. Like, logically speaking, if Brigham Young is part of a plot to have the prophet Joseph Smith murdered and he usurps authority, that means he doesn't have authority. Authority never got passed down to the present day. Not only is the church not true, everything we have in the church isn't true. So that includes our temple marriages, our sealings to our families, all of the work we've done for our dead. This means that our patriarchal blessings, everything that is done by way of the Melchizedek priesthood, is all null and void, invalid. All of it is false, essentially. So logically speaking, that this does not make sense, right? This
Right.
narrative, this new narrative, we would call it just doesn't make sense. When I first started hearing about this, and I call it the Brigham killed Joseph movement. When I first started hearing about this, I didn't really pay a lot of attention, and I kind of just laughed it off because, again, there's no evidence whatsoever to support this, like none. You'd think that if Brigham Young is plotting to have Joseph Smith martyred or murdered, that, we'd have letters, people's writing this in their journals, diaries. You'd have some evidence. There's nothing. I mean, Brigham Young wasn't even a Nauvoo when the prophet Joseph Smith was martyred. And so you'd think, if he's plotting this with Willard Richards and John Taylor, there'd have to have been some sort of communication back and forth, right?
Right.
You have none of that. So again, it's just not based on any historical evidence, facts, real data. It's just sensational, and it's an easily debunked conspiracy theory. However, this particular group, the Doctrine of Christ group, I mean, they're a religious group. They honestly believe that they're teaching the doctrine of Christ. So they have their own group. They have their own website. They do YouTube videos. I guess that's how they lure people into their group, is to try to get them to question or doubt. Could Brigham Young have, usurped the authority of the church? And if he did, well, you need to come over here, and we now have the Melchizedek priesthood that you need to be baptized and things like that. And so they are baptizing people, as I said. And what they're doing now also is they are making a documentary. And this is when it really started to me to get concerning, is that they're actually making a documentary, and the documentary is called Who Killed Joseph Smith? And not to give it free advertising or anything, but they are going to release it soon. And so many people will start to hear about it. And what they do in this documentary is they basically present all of these theories, I guess you could say, of, we don't believe that the physical evidence proves that Joseph Smith was murdered the way that John Taylor and Willard Richards said he was murdered. So they claim to be doing this ballistic testing. And so they basically just reenact what they think could have happened to show that this is how it had to have happened, because the evidence just doesn't back up Willard Richards and John Taylor's testimony, if that makes sense. And so they're able to distort the history that way by calling it forensic evidence, but they don't really have forensic evidence because there's no forensic evidence left, if that makes sense.
So they're recreating the situation in the Carthage jail. Is that what they're doing?
Right.
Okay. Do they have the original ball, the original rifle that they know and has been confirmed to have been shot from whoever it was in the mob that was firing? Because there were multiple people firing into that jail cell, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. To my knowledge, they don't. I mean, all of that is locked up in church history museums and things like that. It's not something that you go to the church and say, "Hey, can I borrow that gun?"
Right. So they're doing.
Think about this logically. You don't have the ball that murdered the prophet Joseph. You don't have the actual gun. I mean, the jail cell itself has been basically remodeled.
Right.
I mean,
that's something really interesting to me, because even in modern forensics, two guns that are the same make and model can give different signatures. And how if I'm not mistaken, the way they do it is as a gun has what's called riflings in the barrel, which they're just twists, grooves that are carved basically into the inside of the barrel that give the bullet spin to help it stabilize as it leaves the gun. And even with modern technology, two guns that are the same make, model, from the same manufacturer, the same factory, made on the same line, they can leave different signatures on a bullet. Now we're talking about the 1800s. We're talking about some time when the technology for riflings and for firearms in general was not what it was today. And now, even without that, and without the actual ball, and I wonder, even there are so many different calibers of those rifles that were used back in those days. Today, it's a little more standardized 45 and 50 caliber, but throughout history, there have been numerous different calibers for those rifles. Are they taking any of this into consideration, or is it just a blatant a reconstructing of a situation? I guess that's what you said. It's exactly what you said. You said that it's how they believe it should have been. Are there any of those details and calibers and any of that kind of stuff that they even mention?
Right. So it's important for people to understand, going into this movie or this documentary, if they choose to watch it or whatever, to understand that, the truth, it was not the end goal, right? The truth, they weren't it will be presented as, we just want answers. The forensic evidence just doesn't match the testimony. And so we just want answers. So it's under the guise of just asking questions, right? Because that's what, the adversary does. He masquerades lies as questions, right? I'm just asking questions. And so they go in just saying, well, these are in presenting theories of how it could have happened, right? And so what does it do? It causes people to start to question the narrative, to question the testimony of the only actual two witnesses of the martyrdom. And so what they do then is, because there is actually someone who has done the ballistic testing, and it's the research of two men. They are, their names are Joseph and David Lyon. And they actually did have, similar questions. They had questions about the physical evidence. And so they went in and they did do the ballistic testing and they did do the research. Then they wrote an article about what it reveals about the assassination of Joseph and Hiram Smith. The research of David W. Lyon and Joseph L. Lyon, they actually did prove through ballistic testing by the diameter of the bullet holes in the door, by the diameter of the bullet holes in Hiram Smith's clothing and face, and by the dent in his watch, that he was killed by a .69 caliber musket. And that was the standard musket issued to militia units in Illinois at that time. And the military muskets used are supported by Willard Richards' mention of the bayonets. And you can find their research on the BYU's website, essentially. And so what they've done is, I'm sure they've used their research, their mention of the ballistic testing, and then they've kind of just twisted it to fit their narrative. And I know I've had a friend that was able to watch the documentary, because they are showing it in private settings. And this person said that they reenact the scene where Hiram Smith is shot in the face. And they actually show John Taylor grabbing him by the shoulders from behind and thrusting a gun on his neck and shooting him. And that's how they claim he was shot in the face. So you can see how they are now portraying to their viewers, to their audience, this is a possibility, the possibility that John Taylor is responsible for Hiram's murder, which is astonishing to me.
Yeah, I can't even begin to list all of the leaps and assumptions that would have to be made to get to that point. I mean, if this were a court case, it would be dismissed before it ever got anywhere.
Right.
There's always holes that can be poked. I mean, it's far from proven beyond a reasonable doubt, but also that there's no supporting documentation for it. Now, I understand that the argument could be, that they didn't, write letters back and forth. They just, talked to each other about what they were going to do. So I can understand that argument, but then the burden of proof would be on them then to provide enough compelling evidence to support their claim. So far, all I'm seeing is a stack of assumptions and of ignoring plenty of circumstantial evidence and things surrounding it that could really easily poke a lot of holes in this narrative.
Right. And also, I mean, the prophet Joseph Smith's his own prophecies and his own words vindicate Willard Richards, because Willard Richards, he said, was a man after his own heart. He loved Willard Richards. And he actually prophesied a year before his martyrdom that the day would come that Willard Richards would stand in a room with his friends with balls flying around him and he would not be touched. And that prophecy was fulfilled, because Willard Richards was the only one not shot. And we know John Taylor did receive a gunshot wound, which he suffered. It was pretty painful for him.
To the leg, wasn't it?
I believe so, yeah.
I could be wrong about that, but I believe that's what it was.
And we have to remember that, like, shooting victims, okay, imagine you're in the jail cell, your adrenaline, emotions. Do you really believe that Willard Richards and John Taylor are going to remember everything exactly? Where did the bullet, whose gun came from that bullet, when the shooter's on the other side of the jail and, or on the other side of the door. And there's, there are over 35 shots fired into Carthage jail. And, and to suggest that those 35 bullets that came from the mob weren't the ones that killed Joseph and Hiram, but it was Willard Richards and John Taylor that did it. Like that just, again, this isn't logical. Even just from like an evidence standpoint, that's just not logical or reasonable. Or even just imagine that you're the mob, right? There's 100 men that came to Carthage to kill the prophet Joseph Smith. There's 100 men, right? You have enemies from Missouri who were riled up because of William Law. And then you have the Warsaw militia, essentially. And they all are after Joseph Smith. They want him dead. There was even a bounty on Joseph Smith's head that, if they could cut off his head and present on a platter, there was a reward. And so you have all these men just, thirsting for Joseph Smith's blood, right? And they come to Carthage to kill him, only to find he'd been killed by his closest friends and apostles. And they keep it secret, right?
Yeah, very, very good point.
They don't say, hey, look at this false prophet killed by his closest friends. Now we know the church was never true. That doesn't happen, right?
That you would think would show up in somebody's writing somewhere.
Right.
Somewhere at some point.
And, if I may, I'd like just to take the time to kind of, from just a historical standpoint too, what was going on in Nauvoo prior to the martyrdom? Like, what was Joseph Smith doing, and what were his apostles doing? And because a lot of people just don't know this part of the history. And this to me is very fascinating, because the prophet Joseph Smith, he did know, the Lord did reveal to him that he would have to, he would basically be martyred for his testimony. And so the prophet Joseph Smith, he had great anxiety about preparing the church and the apostles for his eventual death. And so there's a quote, and I'll just read it. He says, "My feelings at the present time are that, inasmuch as the Lord Almighty has preserved me until the day, he will continue to preserve me by the united faith and prayers of the saints, until I have fully accomplished my mission in this life, and so firmly established the dispensation of the fullness of the priesthood in the last days, that all the powers of earth and hell can never prevail against it." And I just wanted to bring up that quote. That's in the Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith on page 258, because of this claim by the Doctrine of Christ group that the church doesn't have Melchizedek priesthood. They claim that Joseph Smith was martyred before he was able to give the fullness of the priesthood. But on March 4th and 5th of May of 1842, the prophet Joseph Smith called 9 of the brethren, the apostles, to his side, and he presented to them basically the endowment with the washing, anointing, keywords, signs, and tokens in the upper room of his red brick store in Nauvoo. And he did bestow upon them the fullness of the priesthood, and he gave them all of the keys. And he said to him, "It's not the will of the Lord that I should live, and I must give you here in this upper room all the glorious plans and principles whereby men are entitled to the fullness of the priesthood." And so during the winter of 1843 and 1844, Joseph met daily with the apostles, and sometimes even twice a day, and with all of the members of the Council of the 12. And during this period of time, it was a period of time of tutelage and instruction. And Elder Erastus Snow, he even said that the precious instructions which I received in the councils of the church during that winter and spring were indeed more than I had learned before in my entire life. So what was the prophet Joseph Smith doing prior to his martyrdom? He was instructing the 12 apostles how to lead the church. He gave them the temple endowment with instructions and the keys on how to finish the temple and how to conduct the ordinances in the temple after he was gone. And so he personally had reviewed and restored every principle, every authority, every ordinance pertaining to the kingdom of God to the quorum of the 12 apostles in late March of 1844. So they had all of the keys necessary to continue on the restoration and to continue to carry the church forward.
That's where we leave off for part 1, folks. One more thing before we go. Mormon Traditionalist Podcast is now on YouTube and Rumble, so you can listen there now if you'd like. Just search for Mormon Traditionalist and you will find it. I recommend Rumble, though, because YouTube already took down my episode with Ben McClintock for breaking their disinformation policy or whatever bullcrap. So it's only a matter of time before it's, gone from YouTube entirely, because I will not be bullied or pressured by the big tech overlords. So just listen on Rumble is my suggestion. Support the good guys. And that's it for this episode, folks. Remember to send your questions, comments, and hate mail to mormontraditionalist@gmail.com. Follow me on Instagram @mormontraditionalist for more content. And until next time, remember, never back down from the truth.